When did you learn that the real monsters are hiding in plain sight? I was sitting next to my dementia-stricken husband in his hospice room when 2 officers walked in to question him about molesting our granddaughter. 6 weeks earlier, our son Gail had brought little Roberta to visit. She's 4 and the light of Frank's fading world, the only person who could still make him smile even when he didn't recognize anyone else. Gail stepped out to take a work call, and I was in the bathroom when I heard Roberta giggling. I came out to find Frank playing peekaboo with her, his hands over his eyes, then spreading them wide, saying boo, like he'd done with our kids 40 years ago. Roberta was squealing with joy sitting on the edge of his bed. It was the most alert I'd seen Frank in weeks, actually engaging instead of staring at nothing. Gail walked back in right as Frank was covering Roberta's eyes with his hands to play her turn, and his face went white. He grabbed Roberta so roughly she started crying and stormed out without a word. I tried calling him for days, but he wouldn't answer. Then his wife Rebecca texted me that we were sick people and to never contact them again. I had no idea what happened until the officers showed up. Officer Garrett pulled out a report while Officer Preston stood by the door. Gail Steele reported that Frank Steele molested Roberta Steele on October 15th during a visit. I almost laughed because it was so absurd. Molested? He was playing peekaboo. His hands were on her eyes for the game. Garrett ignored me and leaned over Frank, who was staring at the ceiling. Mr. Steele, did you touch Roberta? Frank didn't respond because Frank doesn't even know his own name most days. Mr. Steele, answer the question, Preston said louder, like Frank was being difficult on purpose. And I started getting irritated. He has dementia. He can't answer you. The hospice nurse Maria came in and confirmed Frank has advanced Alzheimer's. His brain is literally deteriorating. But Garrett said, that's convenient, isn't it? And I felt my first flash of real anger. Convenient? He's dying, Maria said, but Preston smirked. Smart enough to molest a kid, though, and I wanted to slap him. I showed them Frank's medical records, brain scans showing the massive deterioration, doctor's notes saying he has maybe 2 months left. But Garrett said PDOS fake illnesses all the time to avoid consequences, and now I was furious, my voice shaking. Fake? He doesn't even know who I am half the time. Frank started getting agitated from the loud voices and tried to pull out his IV. Maria had to hold his hands while I begged the officers to leave, getting more desperate. We're not going anywhere until he confesses, Garrett said, then grabbed Frank's shoulder and shook him. Frank, did you touch Roberta? And I screamed, get your hands off him. Frank started crying, not understanding why someone was yelling at him, and his heart monitor started beeping faster. His heart rate is 150, Maria said. You need to leave before what? Before he has to answer for being a pedo? Preston said, and I lost it. He was playing peekaboo. Are you insane? Frank's breathing got ragged and he started clutching his chest. Maria hit the emergency button, but Garrett blocked her from getting to the medicine cart. He's faking to avoid talking, and I shoved him. Move! He's having a heart attack. But Preston grabbed my arms. Assaulting an officer? You're under arrest too. Other nurses rushed in and Dr. Kim tried to push past, but they wouldn't move. This is an active crime scene, Garrett said, while Frank's monitor showed his heart rate at 180, then 190, and I was screaming, you're killing him! He played peekaboo. That's all. Frank was gasping, his face turning gray, reaching for me, but the officers held me back. Caroline, he said, the first clear word he'd spoken in days. Caroline, help. And I fought against Preston's grip, sobbing. That's my name. He knows me. Please. But Garrett said, PETAs always manipulate their enablers. And I screamed, he's not. He's a dying old man. They started chest compressions while the officers stood there watching, and I was hysterical now. You monsters! I hate you! Why are you killing my husband before it's time? They disregarded every word I said. We have a court order for his DNA, Preston said while they shocked Frank's heart. Dead or alive, we're getting it. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They were letting him die over peekaboo. Dr. Kim was screaming about calling security, but Garrett said, we have jurisdiction. This is a child molestation case. And I was beyond rage now. It was peekaboo! He put his hands on her eyes. For a game. Frank flatlined for 40 seconds while they worked on him, the officers discussing whether they could still prosecute if he died, and I collapsed on the floor sobbing and screaming. They got him back, but he was unconscious, and Garrett leaned over his bed. When he wakes up, if he wakes up, he's under arrest for child molestation. And you, he pointed at me, you're under investigation for enabling child abuse. We're freezing your assets, taking your passport, and CPS will decide if any grandchildren can ever visit you again. I knew I needed to talk to Gail, but first I had to get through the night. I pulled the chair right up against Frank's bed and sat there watching his chest go up and down, counting each breath like they might stop any second. The machines kept beeping, and I jumped every time the rhythm changed even a little. Maria came in every hour to check his blood pressure and write things down on her clipboard. She lifted up his hospital gown to show me the dark purple marks on his shoulders where Garrett had grabbed him and shook him. I'm taking pictures of these, she said, and pulled out her phone. The flash made Frank twitch, but he didn't wake up. I held his hand all night, and it felt cold like he was already halfway gone. At 6 in the morning, Maria brought me coffee and a muffin from the nurse's station. Cecil Armstrong from Patient Advocacy is coming at 7, she told me. I called him about what happened. I didn't know who Cecil was, but I was glad someone was coming to help. Right at 7, this tall black man in a suit walked in carrying a briefcase. Mrs. Steele, I'm Cecil Armstrong, he said, and shook my hand. Maria told me what occurred yesterday with the officers. He pulled out a camera and started taking pictures of Frank's bruises from different angles. Then he sat down with a notebook and asked me to tell him everything from the beginning. I went through the whole thing, from the peekaboo game 6 weeks ago to the officers blocking the medicine cart yesterday. Cecil wrote fast, filling up pages while I talked. They said he was faking the heart attack, I told him, and my voice got shaky. He flatlined for 40 seconds. Cecil's jaw got tight when I said that part. Dr. Kim came in around 8 carrying a folder thick with papers. These are Frank's latest brain scans scans, she said, and spread them out on the bedside table for Cecil to see. She pointed at the dark spots all over the images. This is massive deterioration of brain tissue. Frank has maybe 10% of normal cognitive function left. She was still mad about yesterday, and her voice got louder. Those officers prevented me from administering cardiac medication during an active medical crisis. That's criminal negligence. Cecil took pictures of all the brain scans too. Can you write a statement about Frank's mental capacity? He asked Dr. Kim. I'll do it right now, she said, and left to get it typed up. I picked up my phone to try Gail again. It rang once, then went straight to voicemail like he'd rejected the call. Gail, it's Mom, I said into the phone. Please listen to me. Dad was playing peekaboo with Roberta, the same game he played with you when you were a baby. You loved it so much you'd laugh until you got hiccups. He doesn't understand what's happening now. The disease ate his brain. He loved you more than anything before he got sick. Please call me back. My voice broke at the end and I had to hang up. Cecil looked up from his notes. The hospital can implement new protocols to protect Frank from further police contact without medical supervision present, he said. He pulled out his laptop and started typing something. I'm drafting a policy right now that requires 2 medical professionals present for any law enforcement interaction with incapacitated patients. I sat back down and took Frank's hand again. His fingers were so cold I rubbed them between mine, trying to warm them up. Maria came back with 2 other nurses I recognized from yesterday. We want to give you our statements, one of them said. They all wrote down what they saw, how the officers wouldn't let them help Frank, how they blocked the medicine cart. That officer said Frank was faking even when his heart rate hit 190, the second nurse wrote. Their anger made me feel less alone in this. Cecil collected all their statements and put them in a folder. This is good documentation, he said. We're building a clear record of what happened. By late afternoon, I was exhausted and Cecil said I should go home to rest. I didn't want to leave Frank, but Maria promised she'd call if anything changed. I drove home and sat at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad. My hands were shaking as I wrote down everything I could remember about October 15th. How Frank's face lit up when he saw Roberta. How she climbed up on his bed all by herself because she loved her grandpa so much. The peekaboo game and her squealing laugh. How it was the first time in weeks Frank had really engaged with anyone. I wrote about all the times Frank played peekaboo with our kids and grandkids over 40 years. Birthday parties and Christmas mornings and Sunday dinners. Hundreds of games, and never once did anyone think it was wrong. My phone rang and I saw a number I didn't recognize. Mrs. Steele? Something doesn't add up about Gail's reaction here. Playing peekaboo is such a normal grandparent thing, so why did he immediately jump to something sinister? I'm curious what made him interpret innocent hand movements during a children's game as something else entirely, especially when his own childhood memories must include the exact same game. This is Helen McCarthy from Child Protective Services, the woman said. I need to schedule a home visit to assess your living environment for potential grandchild visits. Her voice wasn't mean, but it was very professional. Tomorrow afternoon at 2? I agreed because what choice did I have? After I hung up, there was a knock at my door. A man in a baseball cap handed me an envelope. You've been served, he said, and walked away. Inside were court papers authorizing the collection of DNA from Frank at the hospice. My stomach dropped reading it. They were going to put him through more trauma even though he couldn't even open his eyes. I started calling lawyers from the phone book. The first one said he didn't handle elder abuse cases. The second one was too expensive. The third one, Agnes Ferrara, answered her own phone. Tell me what happened, she said. I explained about Frank's dementia and the peekaboo game and the officers causing his heart attack. They shook him, Agnes said, and I could hear real anger in her voice. While he was having a cardiac event, she told me to come to her office right away. Bring all your documentation, she said. We're going to fight this. Agnes's office was small and cluttered with file boxes stacked against the walls, and she moved papers off a chair so I could sit down while she pulled out a yellow legal pad. She wrote down everything I told her about the officers shaking Frank and blocking the medicine cart, asking me specific questions about times and who said what. I showed her the papers about the DNA collection and she shook her head, explaining that we could require any DNA swab to happen only with medical staff present since Frank couldn't consent to anything in his condition. She started typing up emergency motions on her computer to protect Frank from any more police contact without her being there, printing out copies and having me sign them right there. I left her office feeling slightly less helpless and drove back to the hospice where Maria was checking Frank's vitals, his breathing still rough from earlier. That night I couldn't sleep, lying in bed at home replaying Gail's reaction to the peekaboo game over and over in my mind. He'd always been protective of Roberta, maybe too protective, jumping up whenever she fell at the park or got too close to other kids. I remembered how he'd hover over her at family gatherings, never letting her out of his sight, and wondered what fears were driving him to see danger where there wasn't any. The next morning, Una Sterling, the hospice administrator, came to Frank's room holding new printed signs about law enforcement protocols. She taped one to the door saying officers had to notify administration before any patient contact, and told me Evander Gilmore would be increasing security rounds near Frank's room every hour. 2 days later, the officers came back with their court order for the DNA, but this time Una was waiting for them at the front desk. She called Dr. Kim and they both walked with the officers to Frank's room where I was sitting holding his hand. Frank didn't even open his eyes when they swabbed his cheek, just lay there breathing shallow while Garrett stood there looking frustrated that he couldn't shake him awake again. After they left, I spent that whole evening at my kitchen table writing Gail a long letter, describing every detail of that October day. How Frank's face had lit up when he saw Roberta walk in, the first real smile I'd seen from him in weeks, how she'd climbed up on his bed all by herself because she loved her grandpa so much, and how he'd actually engaged with her instead of staring at nothing like usual. I wrote about the peekaboo game, the same one he'd played with Gail when he was little, and sealed the envelope knowing he probably wouldn't read it but needing to try anyway. I dropped it in the mailbox the next morning just as my phone rang. Giovanni Esposito from my bank was calling to warn me that law enforcement had been asking about our accounts. He said they'd put a hold on any large transactions as a precaution, which meant I couldn't access our savings without going through extra steps. The financial pressure made everything harder since Frank's care was expensive, and now I had lawyer fees too. That afternoon, Helen McCarthy knocked on my door for the CPS home interview. She walked through every room of our house, taking notes about the locks on cabinets and asking about our daily routines before Frank went into hospice. I showed her photo albums full of pictures of Frank with all his grandchildren over the years, birthday parties and Christmas mornings where everyone was laughing and playing together. She wrote everything down without much expression, saying she'd file her report within 2 weeks. The next day, Agnes called to tell me the hospital ethics committee wanted me at their review meeting. I sat at a long table while doctors and nurses testified about what happened that day, how the officers wouldn't let them help Frank during his heart attack. Dr. Kim was still angry, telling them how Garrett blocked the medicine cart while Frank's heart rate hit dangerous levels, and Maria described having to hold Frank's hands while he cried from confusion. The committee members took notes and said they were considering formal complaints to state oversight boards about police interference with medical care. Agnes filed an elder abuse complaint against officers Garrett and Preston with Internal Affairs the next morning, documenting everything about how their actions caused Frank's cardiac arrest. Clifford Parks got assigned to investigate and called to schedule an interview with me for the following week. Meanwhile, I was trying to get the security footage from Frank's room and copies of his heart monitor data from that day. The hospital legal department said there was a complex process with privacy reviews and forms to fill out, but Agnes said this evidence would be crucial for our case against the officers. Every day felt like fighting through mud, each small step forward taking enormous effort while Frank lay there getting weaker, his breathing more labored, his skin more gray. 3 days passed before a process server knocked on my door holding a thick envelope. My hands shook opening it and seeing Gail's attorney's letterhead at the top. The paper said Gail was seeking a permanent no-contact order preventing Frank from ever seeing Roberta again. They also wanted to restrict my contact with her, claiming I enabled abuse by not supervising properly. Reading my son's sworn statement felt like being stabbed over and over. He described the peekaboo game as inappropriate touching and said Frank had been grooming Roberta for months. Every happy memory of Frank playing with his granddaughter was twisted into something sick and wrong. The attorney included photos of Roberta that Gail claimed showed signs of trauma, but they just looked like a normal 4-year-old to me. I spent the next 2 days driving around town gathering character letters for Frank. Maria wrote 3 pages about Frank's gentleness even in his confusion, how he never showed any inappropriate behavior. Dr. Kim described his advanced dementia and complete lack of capacity for criminal intent. Our church pastor wrote about Frank teaching Sunday school for 20 years without a single complaint. Mrs. Henderson from next door wrote about Frank helping her grandkids build a treehouse last summer before his diagnosis. Each letter made me cry because they showed the real Frank, not this monster Gail was inventing. I collected 17 letters total, each one describing Frank as a devoted grandfather and good man. On the 3rd morning, I was leaving the hospice when a younger man approached me in the parking lot. He introduced himself as Declan Boyer from the local paper and said someone tipped him off about the police incident. He wanted to know if officers really prevented medical treatment during a cardiac arrest. Part of me wanted to scream the whole truth to anyone who would listen. Another part worried about making things worse for Frank if this became public. I told him I couldn't comment and hurried to my car, but he followed, saying other families had similar experiences. He handed me his card and said to call if I changed my mind about talking. The next day, Agnes called saying Clifford Parks from Internal Affairs wanted to interview me about the officer's conduct. We met at her office downtown, where she could monitor the conversation and protect my interests. Parks was older with gray hair and seemed genuinely concerned as I described what happened. He took detailed notes about Garrett shaking Frank and blocking the medicine cart during the heart attack. He asked specific questions about Preston grabbing me and threatening arrest while Frank was dying. When I showed him the photos Cecil took of Frank's shoulder bruises, Parks's jaw tightened. He said the officers claimed Frank was resisting, and I was interfering with their investigation. Agnes pointed out that a dying dementia patient can't meaningfully resist anything. Parks said he understood, but the union would fight any serious discipline without clear evidence. He couldn't promise any real consequences, but said he'd do his best with what we had. That afternoon, Una Sterling asked me to come to her office at the hospice. She explained the hospital board was meeting about new policies for law enforcement interactions with patients. They wanted stronger protections, but the police union was threatening to stop responding to the hospital calls if restricted. She was pushing for mandatory medical supervision during any patient questioning, but faced major resistance. The board worried about liability if they appeared uncooperative with law enforcement. She showed me draft policies requiring 2 doctors present for any interrogation of incapacitated patients. The police chief had already rejected them as unnecessary interference with investigations. What makes someone see danger in a simple game of peekaboo? Agnes sounds really smart putting together all those protections for Frank. I wonder how she learned to do all that legal stuff so fast. Una said she'd keep fighting but warned me not to expect quick changes to the system. 3 weeks later, we had the hearing about Gail's no-contact order at the courthouse. Gail appeared by video from his lawyer's office, his face cold and distant on the screen. The judge reviewed the police report, the CPS findings, and our stack of character letters. Agnes argued there was no evidence of abuse, just a misunderstood children's game. Gail's attorney claimed we were minimizing serious warning signs and putting Roberta at risk. The judge granted Gail's temporary order preventing any contact between Frank and Roberta. He refused to freeze our assets completely, though, saying there was no evidence we'd flee. He also declined to restrict my contact with Roberta entirely, but said any visits required Gale's permission. Walking out of that courthouse felt like leaving Frank's funeral, even though he was still breathing. That night, I sat alone in our empty house thinking about Gale when he was little. He used to overreact whenever his sister Malia got hurt, even minor scrapes. Once he punched a kid who accidentally knocked Malia off the swings. I wondered if something happened to him that he never told us about, something that made him see danger everywhere. My anger at him mixed with worry about what might have shaped these fears. The next morning, I was going through old photos on my phone when I found a video from 1989. Frank was playing peekaboo with baby Gale, the exact same game, covering Gale's eyes then revealing them. Gale was giggling and reaching for Frank's face with pure joy and trust. My heart broke watching Frank kiss Gale's forehead and tell him he loved him. I emailed the video to Gale with just one line saying this is all it ever was. 2 days later, Declan Boyer called saying hospital staff gave him documents about the police incident. Someone anonymously sent him Frank's heart monitor data showing his cardiac arrest happened during questioning. He wanted me to go on record, but I agreed only to provide documentation without my name attached. I gave him copies of the medical records showing Frank's dementia diagnosis from 8 months ago. He said he was building a larger story about police overreach in medical facilities. The following week, Helen McCarthy interviewed Maria and Dr. Kim about Frank's condition as part of her investigation. Maria described finding Frank and Roberta playing that October day, how innocent and sweet it looked. Dr. Kim explained Frank's brain scans showing massive deterioration in areas controlling judgment and reasoning. Helen took notes about the timeline, how Frank's confusion had progressed over the past year. She seemed to be understanding that Frank couldn't have had any criminal intent. Her preliminary report noted major inconsistencies between the officer's claims and Frank's documented medical incapacity. Clifford Parks called Agnes the next morning asking for permission to request the officer's body camera footage and their patrol car recordings from that day. Agnes signed the forms immediately, but Parks warned us the police union had procedures that could drag this out for weeks or even months. He explained how officers get 10 business days to review footage before release, then the union lawyers get another 10 days, then the department reviews for privacy concerns, which takes another 2 weeks minimum. The whole system felt designed to wear people down until they gave up fighting for justice. I spent that afternoon at the hospice when Una Sterling pulled me aside to tell me they were running mandatory training for all staff about handling law enforcement requests after what happened to Frank. She asked if I wanted to skip it, but I decided to sit in the back row of their conference room. The trainer never said our names, but described an incident where officers tried to question a dementia patient about alleged abuse and caused a medical emergency. Several nurses kept turning to look at me with knowing expressions, and Maria reached over to squeeze my hand when the trainer talked about staff being blocked from giving emergency medication. The whole room got quiet when they showed new protocols requiring 2 supervisors present for any police interaction with patients. 3 days later, Dr. Kim met with me and Agnes about moving Frank to a different wing of the hospice. She said the stress from the police incident meant Frank needed a calmer environment for whatever time he had left. The new room was smaller, but faced a garden where birds came to the feeders every morning. Frank seemed more peaceful there, his breathing steadier without the noise from the main hallway. I spent hours watching sparrows land on his windowsill while he slept, wondering if he could hear them singing. That same week, Agnes forwarded me an email from Rebecca's attorney with the subject line, "Cease all contact attempts." Rebecca had written 3 pages calling me an enabler who always made excuses for Frank's behavior. She claimed I ignored warning signs for years and put grandchildren at risk with my denial. The worst part was a line saying Gale had been telling her for years about concerning incidents from his childhood that I supposedly dismissed. I knew this was Gale rewriting history to justify his current position, but it still hurt to see my daughter-in-law painting me as some kind of monster. Agnes read through it and said Rebecca's accusations were vague and legally meaningless, but emotionally designed to wound. She suggested we propose mediation with Gale to avoid a long court battle that Frank might not survive to see resolved. I didn't want to sit across from my son while he called his dying father a predator, but Agnes said mediation might be our only chance to restore any family connection before it was too late. I agreed, even though my stomach turned at the thought of facing Gale's accusations directly. The mediation got scheduled for the following Tuesday at a neutral law office downtown. Gale appeared on a video screen from his home, his face hard and cold like I'd never seen it before. The mediator asked me to explain what happened that October day, and I went through every detail of the peekaboo game. I described Frank's joy at seeing Roberta, how it was the first time he'd smiled in weeks, how his hands only touched her face as part of the game we'd all played for 40 years. Gale kept shaking his head and repeating, "I know what I saw," over and over. He wouldn't look at the medical records showing Frank's dementia or listen to the mediator's questions about alternative interpretations. When I tried to show him the old video of Frank playing the same game with baby Gale, he disconnected from the call. The mediator wrote up notes saying we'd reached an impasse with no agreement possible at this time. 2 days after the failed mediation, Declan Boyer's article came out in the morning paper with the headline, "When Police Interrogate the Dying." He didn't use our names, but described a case where officers caused a dementia patient to have a heart attack while questioning him about unproven allegations. He included quotes from medical ethics experts about law enforcement overreach in healthcare facilities. My phone started ringing with people who recognized our situation from the details. 3 different families called to say similar things had happened to their loved ones with dementia or mental illness. One woman sobbed as she told me about her mother with schizophrenia being tackled by police in her nursing home over a false theft report. These stories made me realize we weren't alone in facing this kind of injustice. Clifford Parks called that Friday with frustrating news about the body camera footage. He'd finally gotten a response from the police department saying the officers' cameras were not activated during the incident incident at the hospice. Agnes immediately said this was suspicious since department policy requires cameras to be on for any investigation involving potential felonies. Parks agreed it seemed convenient, but said proving intentional violation would be nearly impossible without witnesses. The cover-up felt almost as violating as what they did to Frank in the first place. But then Evander Gilmore from the hospital security called with better news. He'd pulled all the security footage from the hallway outside Frank's room showing the officers blocking Dr. Kim from reaching Frank during his cardiac arrest. The video clearly showed Dr. Kim trying to push past Officer Garrett while he stood in the doorway refusing to move. Evander made multiple copies before anyone could make the footage disappear and gave us the files on 3 different flash drives. Agnes said this evidence would be crucial for both the internal affairs investigation and any potential civil case. The stress and mounting legal bills triggered an audit notice from our insurance company about Frank's hospice care. They suddenly wanted 5 years of medical records and detailed explanations for every treatment decision. The letter implied they might deny coverage retroactively if they found any irregularities. Giovanni helped me restructure our accounts to handle the financial strain, while our assets remained partially frozen from the investigation. He moved money from our retirement savings to cover the immediate bills and set up payment plans for the legal fees. The whole mess felt like punishment on top of punishment for the crime of playing peekaboo. Ottilie knocked on my door the next morning holding a casserole dish and looking uncomfortable. She set it on my kitchen counter and started talking fast about how people at the grocery store kept asking her questions about Frank and the police. She said the cashier wouldn't make eye contact with me anymore, and 2 women from church crossed the street when they saw me coming. The way she kept fidgeting with her purse strap told me she was trying to warn me without being mean about it. 3 pages of accusations from Rebecca calling me an enabler? That's quite a shift from someone who used to bring Roberta over for visits. I'm really curious what Gail's been telling her about his childhood. These concerning incidents she mentions seem to appear out of nowhere right when he needs them to support his case. I thanked her for the food and watched her leave quickly like she was scared someone might see her at my house. The next few days proved she was right. At the pharmacy, the other customers moved away from me in line, and the pharmacist double-checked Frank's prescriptions like I might be getting drugs for something bad. Our mail carrier left packages on the step instead of knocking like usual. Even the kid who mowed our lawn stopped showing up. Agnes called that afternoon with good news from court. The judge had granted her motion requiring any police questioning of Frank to happen only with his attorney present. She said the judge acknowledged Frank's medical incapacity and called him a victim of overzealous law enforcement. It was the first time anyone official had recognized Frank wasn't the bad guy here. She faxed me the court order and I made copies to keep at the hospice and at home. Maria posted one at the nurse's station, and Una put another in Frank's medical file. The relief of having legal protection felt huge, even though Frank was still unconscious from the cardiac arrest. Helen McCarthy's report arrived 3 days later by certified mail. Agnes came over to read it with me since the legal language was confusing. The report cleared me of enabling abuse and said there was no evidence I knew about or participated in any inappropriate behavior. But it also said the case against Frank remained open pending DNA results, even though Helen noted his medical condition made any prosecution impossible. The worst part was the grandchildren contact restriction stayed in place indefinitely. Agnes said it was better than we could have hoped for, but I just felt empty reading how my life as a grandmother was officially over because of peekaboo. That Thursday afternoon, I was sitting with Frank when his eyes opened and actually focused on me for the first time since his heart attack. He squeezed my hand and said my name clearly. Then he looked around the room confused and asked where Gail was. My chest got tight, but I managed to smile and tell him Gail was working, that he'd been busy with a big project. Frank nodded like that made sense and asked if Gail still liked those model airplanes they used to build together. I pulled out my phone and showed him old photos from Gail's childhood, the 2 of them at baseball games and camping trips and birthday parties. Frank smiled at each one, pointing at details and remembering little stories about that day at the lake, or that time Gail caught his first fish. We spent an hour like that before Frank got tired and drifted back to sleep. It was probably the last real conversation we'd ever have, and I couldn't even tell him the truth about our son. Agnes helped me write the impact statement for internal affairs that weekend. She kept reminding me to stick to facts and measurable harms instead of emotions. I wrote about Frank's cardiac arrest lasting 40 seconds, the ongoing complications from oxygen deprivation, the bruises on his shoulders from being shaken. I included Maria's documentation of his elevated heart rate and the medical bills from the emergency intervention. I described how Frank went from occasional lucid moments to being mostly unconscious after the trauma. Agnes reviewed every word to make sure it was legally solid. We submitted it with all the supporting medical documents and witness statements from the nurses. Clifford Parks called the following week with the investigation results. He said officers Garrett and Preston would face policy violations for excessive force and failure to follow medical emergency protocols, but he explained that proving criminal intent to harm was nearly impossible since they claimed they were conducting a legitimate investigation. The officers would get suspensions and retraining, but keep their jobs and pensions. He sounded frustrated himself, saying he'd pushed for more serious consequences, but the union lawyers fought everything. I thanked him for trying, even though the injustice of it burned in my stomach. After I hung up, I just sat there too tired to even cry anymore. My phone buzzed with a text from Gail that just said, "Stop calling." 2 words after weeks of trying to reach him. I stared at them for a long time, then went through my photos until I found one from his 4th birthday. Frank was teaching him patty cake, both of them laughing as their hands met in the simple rhythm. Another innocent game that brought such joy before Gail forgot what love looked like. I sent him the photo without any words, because what was left to say? He didn't respond. The hospital's legal department contacted Agnes about a settlement offer 2 days later. They wanted to cover Frank's medical bills from the cardiac arrest arrest and implement new protective policies if we agreed not to sue. Agnes said their first offer was insulting, so she countered with demands for mandatory staff training, posted warnings about patient rights during law enforcement interactions, and a formal acknowledgement of the hospital's failure to protect Frank. The negotiations went back and forth for a week, with Agnes pushing for more accountability and real changes that would protect other vulnerable patients. She kept me updated but handled all the legal details herself. After 2 weeks of negotiations, we reached a settlement with the hospital. They agreed to name the new policy Frank's Law, requiring 2 medical professionals present for any law enforcement interaction with incapacitated patients. They'd also pay all of Frank's medical bills related to the cardiac arrest, provide mandatory training for all staff about patient advocacy during police encounters, and post clear warnings about patient rights in every room. Agnes said it was the best outcome we could get, and at least something positive would come from Frank's suffering. Signing those papers felt like accepting defeat and victory at the same time. The day after the settlement, Sybil Newton called saying she'd heard about our case from someone at the hospital. She ran a support group for families dealing with false accusations and invited me to their next meeting. She said hearing other people's stories had helped her after her own husband was wrongly accused of theft by a confused nursing home resident. I wrote down the meeting information, even though I wasn't sure I was ready to share Frank's story with strangers yet. 3 days later, Dr. Kim called asking me to come in right away because Frank had developed a cough that was getting worse. I rushed to the hospice and found him struggling to breathe, his chest rattling with each inhale while nurses adjusted his oxygen mask. Dr. Kim showed me the chest x-ray with cloudy patches throughout both lungs and explained his body was too weak from the cardiac arrest to fight the pneumonia that had set in. She pulled me aside and spoke quietly about comfort care, saying we could keep fighting with antibiotics and breathing treatments, but it would only prolong his suffering without changing the outcome. I watched Frank gasping even with the oxygen at maximum and signed the papers switching to comfort measures only, my hand shaking so bad I could barely hold the pen. The nurses removed the monitors and IV antibiotics, leaving just morphine for pain and medications to ease his breathing. 2 weeks passed before Clifford Parks finally called about the internal affairs investigation. He came to Agnes's office with a thick folder and went through their findings, showing us statements from nurses confirming the officers blocked medical treatment. The review board had ruled that officers Garrett and Preston violated multiple department policies, including interference with medical care and excessive force on an incapacitated person. Their punishment was 2 weeks unpaid suspension and mandatory retraining on dealing with vulnerable populations before returning to full duty. Clifford's jaw was tight when he told us the union fought for even less, but this was the maximum they could get without criminal charges, which the prosecutor declined to file. Agnes asked about civil rights violations, but Clifford said federal authorities weren't interested in a case involving someone accused of child abuse, even if the accusation was false. I felt sick knowing those officers would be back on the streets in 2 weeks, probably doing the same thing to other families. The next morning, Giovanni called with the first good news in weeks. The court had reviewed the asset freeze request and declined to implement a full hold since there was no evidence of flight risk or hidden assets. The bank was lifting all restrictions immediately, and I could access our accounts again, including Frank's pension and our savings. Not having to worry about paying for groceries or Frank's medications took away one layer of stress, even though money felt meaningless compared to everything else we'd lost. Helen McCarthy scheduled a final meeting at her office downtown, where she officially closed the CPS investigation. She handed me a letter stating no evidence was found to support claims of enabling abuse, and my home was deemed safe for grandchildren. Frank's case would be marked as unable to prosecute due to medical incapacity rather than cleared or dismissed, which she said was standard procedure when the accused couldn't participate in their defense. It wasn't the vindication Frank deserved, but at least the investigation was over, and no restrictions would be placed on me seeing other grandchildren if Gail ever changed his mind. Agnes arranged one more mediation session with a different mediator, hoping Gail might reconsider now that the investigations were closed. I sat in the conference room for an hour while Gail appeared on video from his lawyer's office, refusing to even look at the camera. The mediator tried everything, suggesting supervised visits with multiple adults present, or even just a video call so Roberta could say goodbye, but Gail kept repeating that he knew what he saw and wouldn't expose his daughter to danger. How does someone's mind work when they can remember building model airplanes with their dad, but not understand why their dad is in hospice? Frank asking about Gail and sharing those old memories while having no idea what's happening now makes me wonder how our brains decide which pieces to keep and which to lose. When the mediator asked if he'd consider it after Frank passed, Gail said it didn't matter because the damage was done, and he needed to protect his family from people who couldn't see the truth. The session ended with Gail disconnecting without saying goodbye, and his lawyer informing Agnes that any further contact attempts would be considered harassment. A week later, Declan Boyer's follow-up article appeared in the Sunday paper with a photo of the new signs posted in every hospice room. Una had given him a full interview about how Frank's case exposed dangerous gaps in their protocols and led to comprehensive policy changes. The article detailed the new requirements, including mandatory administrative notification before any law enforcement questioning of patients, required medical supervision during any interactions, and immediate intervention rights for doctors if patient health was at risk. Other hospitals in the region were adopting similar policies, and the State Hospital Association was drafting guidelines based on what they were calling Frank's Law. At least other families might be protected even if it was too late for us. With all the legal matters settled, I focused on making Frank's remaining time as peaceful as possible. Every morning, I brought his favorite music on an old CD player, filling his room with the jazz standards he used to whistle while shaving. I read him stories about when Gail and his sister were young, describing birth birthday parties and family vacations, hoping somewhere deep inside he could hear me and know he was loved. The nurses gave us extra privacy and brought me coffee without being asked, their kindness a small comfort. I held his hand for hours, feeling how thin his fingers had become, telling him over and over that he was safe, and I was there, and nobody would hurt him again. One afternoon, I asked Agnes to make one final attempt at reaching Gail about letting Roberta say goodbye. She called his lawyer, proposing every safeguard imaginable, including having the visit supervised by medical staff, keeping it under 5 minutes and allowing Gail to be present the entire time. The response came back within an hour in a terse email saying Gail's position was final, and any further attempts at contact regarding this matter would result in a restraining order. That night, I started gathering everything I could find of Frank with Roberta. Photos from her first 3 birthdays when Frank was still himself, videos of them playing in our backyard, him pushing her on the swing set he'd built himself. I found a recording on my phone of Frank reading her favorite book about a bunny who gets lost and finds his way home, his voice still strong and clear from just 2 years ago. I wrote Roberta a long letter explaining how much her grandfather loved her, how his illness took away his ability to understand things, but never changed his heart. I sealed everything in a wooden box I bought at the craft store and asked Agnes to put it in her safe until Roberta turned 18, when she could legally receive it without her parents' permission. On a quiet Tuesday morning, 3 months after the police incident, Frank's breathing changed to a shallow, irregular pattern. Dr. Kim said it could be hours or days, but the end was close. I called Gail and left a voicemail that his father was dying if he wanted to say goodbye, but he didn't call back. I sat beside Frank's bed, holding his hand and talking to him about our wedding day, our first apartment, the morning Gail was born, and how proud Frank had been. His breathing slowed throughout the day, and just after sunset, it stopped completely. No struggle or pain, just silence. I kissed his forehead and told him he was free now. When I called Gail to tell him his father had passed, the phone rang once before going to voicemail, and I left a simple message that Frank died at 7:23 p.m. and funeral arrangements would be posted in the paper if he wanted to attend. The funeral home was almost empty when I walked in carrying Frank's favorite blue tie for them to dress him in. Maria came with 2 other nurses from the hospice, and they sat in the second row behind me. Ottilie drove over from next door even though her hip was bad and she needed her walker to get around. Agnes showed up in a black suit and squeezed my shoulder before sitting down. A couple from our old church came, and Frank's friend from his poker group 20 years ago. The funeral director kept checking his watch and looking at the door like more people might come. I counted 12 people total in a room that could hold 100. The empty chairs where Gail and Rebecca and Roberta should have been sitting felt bigger than the people who were there. The chaplain from the hospice said nice things about Frank being at peace now and read some Bible verses. Nobody else wanted to speak, so I stood up and talked about Frank teaching our kids to ride bikes and building that swing set in the backyard. My voice cracked when I mentioned how he loved being a grandfather. After the service, Agnes drove me to her office to start on Frank's estate papers. She pulled out folders and forms while I signed my name over and over on different lines. The prosecutor's office sent a letter saying no charges would be filed against Frank now that he was deceased. Agnes read it out loud and then crumpled it up and threw it in her trash can. The next week, Sybil called to invite me to her support group that met on Tuesday nights at the community center. I sat in a circle with 8 other people whose family members had been falsely accused of terrible things. A woman named Kendall talked about her husband being accused by a neighbor and losing his teaching job even after being cleared. An older man described his son's ex-wife making up stories during their custody battle. Everyone nodded when I told them about the peekaboo game and how Gail wouldn't listen. Sybil gave me tissues and said grief gets complicated when you lose someone twice. I started going every Tuesday, and it helped to hear other people understood what I was going through. 3 weeks after the funeral, Clifford called me at home to say the internal affairs investigation was finished. He told me Garrett and Preston had to take a training course about dealing with dementia patients. The department was making new rules about questioning people in hospice. He thanked me for cooperating with their investigation and said Frank's case would help protect other sick people. I wanted to feel like it meant something, but mostly I just felt tired. That afternoon, I went to the craft store and bought special paper and a wooden box with a lock. I sat at my kitchen table and wrote Roberta a long letter about her grandfather. I told her about the day she was born and how Frank held her for the first time. I described all the games they played together before he got sick. I explained what dementia does to a person's brain and how the disease took him away from us. I wrote about the peekaboo game and what really happened that day in October. Agnes helped me set up a trust to make sure the letter would reach Roberta when she turned 18. We sealed everything with a notary, and Agnes locked it in her office safe. 2 months after Frank died, my phone buzzed with a text from Gail asking about the life insurance policy. No hello or how are you doing, just wanting to know the policy number and how much it paid out. I texted back the information without any other words because what else was there to say? He didn't respond, and I didn't expect him to. On a cold morning, I drove to the cemetery with fresh flowers for Frank's grave. The headstone was simple with just his name and dates and beloved husband, because I couldn't put beloved father and grandfather when Gail wouldn't even come to the funeral. On my way out, I passed the hospice and saw new signs by the entrance. Big blue signs that said patient rights and Frank's law with rules about law enforcement visits. Una had kept her promise to make sure what happened to Frank wouldn't happen to anyone else. I sat in my car in the parking lot and cried for a long time. 6 months after Frank died, I was sitting at a different kitchen table in a smaller apartment because I'd sold the house. I volunteered twice a week with families dealing with dementia, helping them understand what to expect. Sometimes I told them about Frank and the investigation if I thought it would help them be prepared. Gail never called or wrote except for that one text about money. I stopped hoping he would. The investigation was over and nobody was getting prosecuted for anything. I had my Tuesday group and my volunteer volunteer work and Agnes checking on me sometimes. It wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was the life I had now, and that had to be enough. Well, that's gonna wrap it up for today. I had a lot of fun just puzzling over all this stuff with you, and I hope you did too. Stay curious out there, and if you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.